You've seen 1,000 westerns, the gunfight at noon, the outlaw on horseback, the sheriff with the badge and the jaw and the squint. Somebody always gets shot. Somebody always rides off into the sunset looking like they just solved something important. Here's what those movies never showed you. A cowboy's average day had 0 gunfights. Most cowboys went their entire working life, years of it, without ever pointing a gun at another human being. What they actually did every single day was ride, slowly, for hours, across empty land, looking at grass. That's it. The real Wild West was so quiet, so repetitive, so genuinely uneventful most of the time, that if Hollywood showed you the honest truth, you'd fall asleep in the theater, which is exactly why we're here tonight. So get comfortable, because for the next couple of hours, we're going to actually live a day out there. Not the movie version, the real one, the slow, ordinary, surprisingly peaceful version that nobody ever talks about. Let your body settle. You've got nowhere to be, nothing to do. We got all night. Part 1. Before the sun comes up, it's dark. Not the kind of dark you're probably used to, where there's always some light leaking in from somewhere. A street light, a phone, the glow of a clock on the nightstand. This is real dark. The kind of dark that existed before electricity, before cities, before all of it. You open your eyes and you genuinely cannot tell if they're open or closed. That's how dark it is. And it's cold. Not freezing, maybe. Depends on the season. Depends where you are. But cold enough that your nose knows it before the rest of you does. That tip of the nose cold. That quiet signal that the air outside the blanket is not your friend right now. And somebody near you is already moving. This is what gets me about the people who actually lived out there in the 1870s, 1880s. They got up in the dark voluntarily. Not because an alarm went off. Not because they had a morning meeting. They got up because the animals needed feeding and the animals didn't care what time it was, and neither did the work. On a cattle ranch, you were up by 4:30, sometimes 4. The sky wasn't even hinting at light yet, and you'd pull on your clothes. And here's something the movies always skip. You slept in most of your clothes. Not because it was romantic or rugged, because it was cold and your cabin had no insulation worth mentioning, and getting dressed in the dark when you're half asleep is genuinely hard. So you just didn't fully undress in the first place. Boots, though. Boots you set close to your bunk, but you check them before you put them on. Scorpions liked boots. Cowboys learned this the hard way, and then they never forgot it. Every single morning, check the boots first. You pick the boot up, you turn it upside down, you give a shake. Then you put it on. It took about 3 seconds. It became as automatic as breathing. And the cowboys who forgot, well, they learned to remember after. That. The bunkhouse. That's where the ranch hands slept. This long, low building that smelled permanently of leather and wood smoke and the particular smell of men who work outside. It was starting to stir. 6, 8, 10 guys. Canvas cots. Wool blankets that were never quite warm enough and never quite clean enough, but were yours, and you were used to them. And after a long day of work, they felt like the best thing in the world anyway. Someone in the corner was still snoring. Someone else was already outside. The cook had been up for an hour already, and if you paid attention, you could smell it. faintly from across the yard, the fire he'd started. Coffee was coming. That mattered. That mattered a lot. There was a ritual to the beginning of a frontier morning that you'd recognize if you'd ever been camping for long enough. The first person up moves quietly, trying not to disturb the others. He pulls on his boots, checks them first, stands up slowly so the cot doesn't creak too much, steps over the sleeping forms on the floor in the winter. When it got crowded, pushes out the door into the cold. And then the cold. There's something clarifying about cold air first thing in the morning. It hits you, and suddenly you're awake in a way that no gradual awakening can match. Your eyes open all the way. Your lungs pulling a full breath. You are, whether you wanted to be or not, present. Let's step outside for a second. You push open the bunkhouse door, and the cold hits you properly now, full in the face. And you stand there for a moment, not because you plan to, just because of the sky. This is the thing people who lived out there kept writing about in their diaries and their letters home. The one thing that shows up over and over in the accounts of cowboys and homesteaders and settlers and everyone else who lived that life. They wrote about the sky because there were no city lights. There was no haze. There was nothing between you and the full, unfiltered, overwhelming sky. And at 4 a.m. on the Great Plains or in the hill country of Texas or out in the high desert of Arizona, that sky was something you just don't see anymore. Stars you could count for an hour and still not be done. The Milky Way not as a vague smudge, but as an actual river of light. Genuinely bright, running from one horizon clean across to the other. A cowboy named Charlie. Siringo. He wrote a memoir in 1885, one of the first cowboys ever to do that. He spent more time in it describing the night sky than describing any cattle drive. His editor probably wanted more drama, but Charlie kept writing about the sky. I think Charlie understood something. You stand there for maybe a minute, just looking up, the cold on your face, the dark all around, the stars. Then you go feed the horses. The horses came first, always, before breakfast, before anything else. This wasn't a rule someone wrote down. It was just understood. Your horse wasn't a vehicle. Your horse was your partner in the most practical and literal sense. Without a healthy, well-fed horse, you couldn't do your job. You couldn't cover the ground you needed to cover. In some situations, out alone on the range, far from anyone, a lame or exhausted horse wasn't just an inconvenience. It was dangerous. So the horses ate first. And feeding horses isn't fast. Each one needs water and hay and feed, and a once-over to check for anything wrong, a cut. From the fence, a loose shoe, swelling in a leg that wasn't there yesterday. You ran your hands down each leg every morning. You looked them in the eye. You got to know each horse as an individual because they were individuals, different personalities, different things that spooked them, different gaits that told you different things about how they were feeling that day. Some cowboys named their horses. Some didn't, not because they didn't care, but because on a big outfit you might be riding different horses on different days, and getting too attached had complications. But they cared. Every one of them cared. There's a particular quality to the relationship between a working cowboy and a good horse that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. It wasn't sentimental in the movie sense. It was practical and deep at the same time. The horse trusted you to care for it. You trusted the horse to carry you safely, to react correctly when something startled it, to keep going when you needed it to. That mutual reliance built something real over the weeks and months of working together. By the time the horses were sorted, the sky was starting to change. Not sunrise yet, but that first suggestion of it, a slight lightening in the east. Not light exactly, more like the darkness becoming less sure of itself. And the cook was hollering, "Breakfast." Now here's where I want to talk to you about beans. I know. Stay with me. Beans are the foundation of frontier cooking in a way that's hard to fully communicate. Not because people loved beans particularly, although some did, but because beans made sense. They were cheap. They kept forever in dried form. They were filling in a way that held you through a long physical day. And when you cooked them long and slow, with salt pork or bacon fat and whatever seasoning the cook had on hand, they were genuinely good. The cook on a cattle outfit, called the Cookie, which sounds like a joke but was a real title taken, seriously, had started as beans the night before. That's how you did pinto beans out there. You put them on before you went to sleep and let them go all night, low and slow, and by morning they were soft and rich and ready. Along with the beans, biscuits, not the delicate, flaky biscuits of a nice restaurant. Dense, heavy, substantial biscuits cooked in a Dutch oven sitting in the coals of the fire. The bottom got darker than you'd maybe like. The inside was chewy and thick. They were filling the way a brick is solid. You ate one, and it just sat there in your stomach doing its job for hours. And coffee. The coffee deserves its own moment. Frontier coffee was made by boiling water, adding grounds directly, a lot of grounds, and sometimes cracking a raw egg into it. The egg helped the grounds settle to the bottom. You poured carefully and tried not to get grounds in your teeth, and mostly you succeeded. It was strong, genuinely, almost aggressively strong. Dark and thick in a way that modern coffee just isn't. And in a tin cup, always a tin cup which burned your hands when it was hot and went cold faster than you wanted. It was the first real comfort of the day. People talked about that coffee, missed it when they didn't have it. There. Our account from cattle drives where the coffee ran out before the drive was done and the mood dropped noticeably, measurably. One cowboy wrote to his sister that he could endure almost anything the range threw at him as long as the coffee was good. He wasn't being poetic. He meant it. Breakfast happened fast, not rushed exactly, efficient. Men ate standing up sometimes or sitting on whatever was available, a log, a saddle, the tongue of the wagon. Plates were tin. Everything was functional and nothing was decorative. You ate what was in front of you. You ate all of it. When you were done, you rinsed your plate and cup. The cook appreciated this. And you went and got your horse, and the day really began. And here's the part where the Wild West of the movies and the actual Wild West split into two completely different stories. In the movies, After breakfast, something happens. Something dramatic. An argument. A threat. A stranger rides in with bad news. In real life, after breakfast, a cowboy went and did as assigned. Ride. That's it. He rode out to check on a section of the range, to look for strays, to count cattle, and make sure the numbers added up. And then he rode back. This took hours. On a working ranch of any size, your territory might be 10 or 15 miles across. You covered at a walk, not a gallop, a walk, because a walking horse doesn't tire, and you needed that horse for the full day and tomorrow and the day after. So you walked for hours across the land, and it was quiet. The wind. There was almost always wind on the plains. The particular rustling, whispering sound of tall grass moving. The rhythmic sound of your horse's hooves on the ground. The creak of the saddle. Sometimes far off cattle. That low communal sound, more felt than heard, that a herd makes when it's grazing in content. That was the job. Hours of that. And I want to sit with that for a second, because I think we've lost something in how we understand boredom now. We treat it like an emergency, like something to be fixed immediately. We reach for the phone, the screen, the anything. These cowboys rode for 6, 8 hours across open land with nothing but their own thoughts and the sound of the wind. And most of them, in what they wrote, didn't describe that as torture. They described it as just the job, the thing you did, the rhythm of the day. Some of them clearly loved it. Charlie Siringo described long solo rides as the best part of the work. Just him and his horse and the land. There's something in that worth thinking about. The land itself changed as you moved through it. A rise that gave you a view of 10 miles of flat grass in every direction. A dry creek bed that still had a little water in it, enough for the horse to stop and drink. A stand of cottonwood trees that somehow found water and grew tall enough to cast real shade. Small things. But out there, small things were the whole world. You noticed the way the grass was different colors depending on how wet the season had been. You noticed the clouds, not because you were a poet, but because the clouds told you something about what the weather was going to do, and that mattered. A sudden storm on the open plains wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a real event. You learned to read the sky the way other people read a newspaper. The birds were company in their way. Hawks that rode the thermals high above. Ground birds that flushed up suddenly and spooked the horse briefly before everything settled again. Once in a while, an eagle, far enough away to be impressive. The horse had its own opinions about the day. A good cattle horse developed something close to judgment. It learned which cattle were strays, which way the herd was likely to drift where the water sources were. An experienced cowboy trusted his horse's instincts because the horse had often been over this ground before and remembered things the rider had forgotten. You rode and you watched and you thought your own thoughts, and the hours passed. There was something meditative about it that nobody who romanticized the cowboy ever really captured. Not the drama of action, but the quietness of sustained attention. Watching the land, watching the cattle, being present in a way that our busy modern lives rarely demand of us. By midday, the sun was high and warm, and the shadows were short. You stopped somewhere with shade if you could find it. Let the horse rest. Drank water from your canteen. Maybe ate something cold from what the cook had packed for you that morning. Then you got back on and rode some more. By late afternoon, your body knew it had been doing this all day. Your back talked to you a little. Your legs. The horse's gait was the same as it had been the morning, patient and steady, but you were more aware of every step. And then you turned for home. The return ride always felt different from the outbound one. The horse knew it was heading back to the barn, and there was a slight change in its energy, not dramatic but real. You felt it through the saddle, the direction of home. You came in with the light fading, the sky going orange in the west, the smell of the cook's fire reaching you before you could see it. You put your horse away first, always the horse first. Then you washed up as best you could with what water was available. Then you ate dinner, and then, not long after it, was time to sleep. That was the day. Most days, that was the Wild West that Charlie Siringo actually lived and wrote about and remembered. Not a gunfight in sight. Part 2. The work nobody makes movies about. Can I tell you something that genuinely surprised me when I started digging into this? The most dangerous job in the Wild West, by the actual numbers, wasn't being a gunslinger. It wasn't being a lawman. It was being a farmer on the Great Plains. Not dangerous in a dramatic way. Dangerous in a slow, grinding, unrelenting way that movies have absolutely no interest in showing you. Dangerous in the way that a drought is dangerous. A blizzard, a grasshopper swarm, a market collapse that happens 1,000 miles away in a city you've never visited, that wipes out the price of wheat overnight and takes your entire year's work with it. That kind of danger. The homesteaders who settled the Great Plains, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, were attempting something genuinely audacious. The land was available, essentially free under the Homestead Act. 160 acres for anyone willing to live on it and work it for 5 years. Sounds like a good deal. It was a brutal deal. The topsoil was some of the richest agricultural soil on the planet. But everything else about the environment was working against you. Summers that baked the ground to concrete. Winters that killed livestock and people with a regularity the survivors wrote about in a kind of stunned flatness. Like they couldn't quite believe it even after it happened. In the winter of 1886 to 1887, they called it the Great Die-Up. Temperatures across the northern plains dropped to 50 below zero. Not wind chill, actual temperature. Cattle by the hundreds of thousands froze to death on the range. Entire ranching operations were wiped out in a single winter. People who'd been wealthy one year were broke by spring. And what did they do? Most of them went back to work because there was nothing else to do. You couldn't quit the land. The land was all you had. So you buried what you lost, and you started again, and you hoped. That's not exciting in the way a gunfight is. Exciting. But I'd argue it takes more courage than any gunfight. Because courage in a gunfight lasts maybe 30 seconds. Courage in the face of a ruined ranch lasts years. The farming work itself was monotonous in the most complete sense of that word. Plowing season came and you plowed. You walked behind a horse-drawn plow, guiding it through the earth, row after row after row, all day long for days at a time. The smell of turned earth, the sound of the plow cutting through roots and rocks, the ache in your arms and your back from holding the plow straight. The Great Plains soil was heavy and thick, dense with the root systems of hundreds of years of prairie grass. Breaking new ground for the first time was particularly hard. The sod was so dense and root-bound that special plows were needed. They called them sodbusters, and the name tells you everything you need to know about what the work was like. Then planting. Each seed dropped by hand or pushed into the ground with a planting stick. Corn, wheat, sorghum, whatever the family had decided to grow that season. You planted and you hoped for rain. Then, waiting. The hardest part for people who were used to controlling their circumstances. You'd done everything you could do, and now the land and the weather would decide. You watched the sky every morning. You felt the wind and tried to figure out what it meant. Farmers developed a deep fluency in weather that most of us have completely lost. They could feel a change coming hours before it arrived. A good rain at the right time was a cause for real relief. Not just financially, emotionally. The crops needed it, which meant the family needed it, which meant everything depended on whether the clouds did what you were hoping they would do. And sometimes they didn't. There are also grasshoppers. In 1874, a plague of Rocky Mountain locusts descended on the Great Plains in numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend. Settlers reported that the swarms blocked out the sun. The sound of millions of insects descending on a field was described as a roaring like a waterfall. And they ate everything, every green thing in their path. Crops that a family had tended for months that represented their entire food supply for the coming winter. Gone in hours. People found grasshoppers inside their homes, inside their clothing, inside their food. The insects ate wooden tool handles. They ate leather harnesses. They ate the wool off the sheep. One settler wrote that the grasshoppers were so thick on the railroad tracks that the trains couldn't get traction and sat stuck, their wheels spinning on the crushed bodies of millions of insects. And then, as suddenly as they came, they left. And the farmers looked at what was left of their fields, and they figured out what to do next, and they did it. Let me tell you about the blacksmith. Every single town in the West had one, or desperately needed one, because iron broke. It always broke. Horseshoes wore through on the rocky ground. Wagon wheels cracked. Plow blades hit rocks and bent. And without iron, life on the frontier came to a stop pretty fast. The blacksmith shop was easy to find. You followed the sound, that rhythmic ringing of hammer on metal, steady and certain, that carried farther than you'd expect. And the heat, even. From the street outside, you could feel it coming off a working forge. Inside, in summer, it was extraordinary. The temperature near an active forge could reach 150 degrees or more. The blacksmith worked in this heat all day, every day. The work was physical and precise at the same time. You couldn't just hit the metal. You had to hit it in exactly the right place, at exactly the right temperature. Metal that's too cool won't move right. Metal that's too hot gets unpredictable, with exactly the right force. You built this knowledge slowly, over years, And once you had it, it lived in your hands and your arms more than in your head. A good blacksmith was respected, not admired the way a gunslinger might be admired. That cheap, temporary kind of admiration. Respected, needed. When a blacksmith was sick, people noticed. When the blacksmith left a small town, it was a minor crisis. That kind of indispensability is worth something. The blacksmith's day was long. You got the forge going early, coal or charcoal, packed and lit and brought to temperature, which took time and careful attention. Then the word came to you, a farmer with a broken plow blade first thing in the morning, a rancher who needed new shoes for 3 horses, a wagon owner whose wheel rim had cracked on the road. You took them in order and you worked. In between larger jobs, you made things. Nails, which sound small, but nails were genuinely valuable and in constant demand. Every building that went up needed hundreds of them. Hooks and hinges for doors, brackets for shelves, small repairs that took a few minutes, but that someone desperately needed. The blacksmith talked to everyone who came in. You heard everything that was happening in the community. Who was building what? Who needed what the conditions were like on the road from the east, whether the supply wagon was running on time. The blacksmith shop was an information exchange as much as a workshop. Then there were the women's jobs, which almost never make it into Western stories, which is a significant omission because women were doing roughly half of all the work and most of the invisible work on top of that. Frontier women cooked 3 meals a day over a wood fire. Every single day in all weather. That sounds simple until you actually think about what it involves. No running water. Water was carried from the well in buckets by hand every time you needed it. No refrigeration. No gas burner you could adjust. Cooking over wood meant managing fire, which is a skill. Too hot and the bread burns. Too cool and the bread doesn't cook through. You learned to read the fire. Women sewed all the clothing and mended it. And when something wore out past mending, they cut it up and used the pieces for something else. A quilt patch, a rag rug. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. They raised children while doing all of this, often in a single room, in the middle of weather, in the middle of illness, in the middle of grief, because grief was common on the frontier. Children died. Spouses died. People died of things we cure in a day now. And still the meals had to be cooked. And the water had to be carried. And the fire had to be kept going. The diaries that frontier women left behind. Don't read like complaint. They read like reports. This happened. Then this. Then this. The writing is direct and plain. There's emotion in it, real emotion, but it's held close, not performed. One woman named Eleanor Pruitt Stewart homesteaded in Wyoming in the early 1900s and wrote letters home about her life that are genuinely beautiful. Not because her life was beautiful, though parts of it were, because she wrote about it honestly. She wrote about the hard days and the funny days and the days she wasn't sure she'd made the right choice and the days she was absolutely certain she had. She wrote about her neighbors, the land, small triumphs, a good canning day, a fence finished, a calf born healthy. She wrote about the quiet. She seemed to love the quiet. The work of keeping a frontier household together was never finished. There was always something that needed doing. Laundry had to be done by hand. Boiling water, scrubbing fabric on A. Washboard, wringing everything out, hanging it to dry, ironing with a flat iron heated on the stove. This was a full day's work by itself, done regularly. Gardens had to be planted and tended, not for pleasure, for survival. A kitchen garden that produced well in summer meant food preserved for winter. Cucumbers became pickles. Beans were dried. Corn was dried or ground into meal. Tomatoes were put up in jars if you had jars. The work of summer was largely the work of preparing for the hardship of winter. Animals had to be tended even in households that weren't primarily ranches. A milk cow or two, some chickens, maybe a few pigs, each one requiring daily attention. The cow needed milking twice a day, every day, without exception. The chickens needed feed and their eggs needed collecting. The pigs needed slop. There's a job I want to mention that you've probably never thought about in the context of the Wild West. The teacher. Frontier communities, as soon as they were established enough to have children in them, tried to establish schools. Because the people who built the frontier, most of them, came from places where education mattered, where being able to read and write was considered a basic human dignity. They wanted that for their children. A frontier school teacher was usually a young woman. 18, 19 years old. She'd passed an exam, been hired by the local school board, which was often just 3 or 4 fathers who decided they needed a school. She was paid maybe $25 a month. She taught all the grades at once in one room. Kids from 6 to 14 all together. Different levels, different abilities, different amounts of time any given child could actually attend, because in farming families, children were also farm workers, and during planting and harvest, the farm came first and school waited. She often boarded with a local family, moving from home to home throughout the year, living out a trunk. And yet the accounts from these women often describe the work as meaningful in a way that surprises you. One teacher named Hannah Millard wrote in her diary that she could feel the children lean in when she read to them, that the room got very still, that even the difficult boys, the ones who didn't want to be there and made trouble, even they went quiet when the story was good. She found that meaningful. I think it was. The teacher also served as a kind of cultural anchor in frontier communities. She represented something. The idea that civilization wasn't just about survival, but about passing knowledge forward about children growing up literate and capable. Parents who'd sacrificed enormously to get to the frontier still wanted their children to have a better chance than they'd had. The teacher was part of that. Some of these school teachers were remarkable people. They taught in unheated buildings in winter, sometimes wearing their coats all day. They dealt with students who spoke different languages. There were German settlers, Scandinavian settlers from every part of America. They improvised when textbooks were scarce. They made do. People were just people out there doing the work in front of them, trying to make things a little better than they found them. Not heroes, not outlaws, just people working. The long, ordinary days. Part 3. what they ate key, and why it mattered I want to talk about salt pork. I know, but stay with me, because salt pork tells you something real about the frontier that nothing else does quite as well. Salt pork was exactly what it sounds like: pork preserved in salt, dense slabs of it, heavily cured, that could survive without refrigeration for months. It was cheap, widely available. It provided fat and protein in a form that lasted, which on the frontier was the single most important quality any food could have. It wasn't delicious on its own, intensely salty, heavy. The texture took some getting used to, but frontier cooks knew the fat was the best part. They rendered it and used it to cook everything else, so nothing was wasted and everything picked up a little flavor from it. This was frontier cooking, making the most of what you had, layering flavor from simple things. The chuck wagon cook, the cookie, was working with a pantry that looked roughly like this: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt, pork, bacon, lard, salt, sugar, carefully rationed, coffee, carefully rationed, dried fruit if the outfit was generous, baking soda, that's most of it. And from this, the good cooks made things that cowboys talked about for years afterward. A cook who could make tender sourdough biscuits with that slight tang was worth his weight. A cook who figured out how to make a peach cobbler from dried peaches and biscuit dough in a Dutch oven buried in coals. That cook was celebrated. Food memory is long. Even rough food, made with care in the right circumstances, sticks with you. There's an account from a cowboy named Teddy Blue Abbott. He rode cattle drives in the 1870s and 1880s and wrote about it later. And he talked about camp food the way some people talk about their grandmother's cooking. Not because it was sophisticated, because it was there at the end of a long day, made by someone who was genuinely trying to feed you well with what he had. He remembered specific meals: the beans on a cold night, the biscuits in the morning, the coffee, always the coffee. Food does that. Good food, or even just food made with real care, accumulates in memory in a way that nothing else quite does. In the towns, food was a little more varied. The general store stocked things that had traveled in by wagon or rail. Coffee from South America routed through New Orleans. Sugar from Louisiana. Canned oysters, which sounds strange now, but canned oysters were wildly popular in the frontier West because canning technology was relatively new and people found them exciting. A taste of somewhere else. Rice, dried peas, molasses dark and thick, used in baking, in beans, in whatever needed sweetening. Fresh vegetables in summer if you had a garden. Potatoes kept well and were valued. Onions kept well and were everywhere. They added flavor and they lasted, which were the two things that mattered most. Going without was a normal part of frontier life. You ran out of something and you either found a substitute or you did without until the next supply wagon came. Sugar ran out, you used molasses. Salt ran low, you were careful with it. You used less. You preserved things differently. The ingenuity of frontier cooks, particularly frontier women who managed household food with the precision of someone running a small supply operation, is genuinely impressive. They knew how to make a lot out of a little. They fed families through droughts and hard winters and the long weeks before the supply wagon came. They just kept cooking, day after day. The fire had to be started, and the food had to be made, and the people had to eat. There's a kind of quiet heroism in that. I know that's a big word for something as ordinary as cooking, but keeping people fed day after day in circumstances that made it hard, that's real. That matters. Meal times were also the social moments of the day. On a cattle drive, the 3 times the crew came together around the chuck wagon were the 3 times a day when everyone stopped being alone and became part of a group again. Cowboys who'd spent the morning in near total solitude came in at noon and sat with their fellow workers and ate and talked and were, for a few minutes, part of something. The conversation around a campfire meal was not dramatic. It was the same kind of conversation people have always had around shared food. Complaints about the weather, observations about the cattle, jokes at each other's expense, stories that people had told before and would tell again. Small things, but they added up. The act of feeding someone is an act of care. Frontier cooks understood this, even if they wouldn't have described it that way. You were taking care of people. You were making sure they had what they needed to keep going. That was not a small thing. Let me tell you about the sourdough starter. A sourdough starter is a live culture, wild yeast and bacteria, living in a mixture of flour and water, fed regularly, kept alive. When you add some to your bread dough, it makes the bread rise. It gives it that characteristic tang. And here's the thing about a sourdough starter. If you feed it, it keeps going for years, decades even. Frontier families carried their starters with them the way they carried their most important possessions. Because in a world without commercial yeast, this was how bread rose. And bread that didn't rise was dense and hard in a way that even hungry people found difficult. So women carried their starters and crocks in the back of the wagon, tended them on the journey west. Some starters had been going for a generation when they reached the frontier. Some were gifts from a neighbor or a family member back home. Pieces of a living culture handed off like something precious, which they were. There are stories of frontier women keeping their sourdough starter warm on cold nights by sleeping with the crock next to them, tucked into the blankets. Because if it got too cold, it would die. That's devotion to bread. And I find it moving in a way I can't entirely explain. Something about the care of it. Something about the continuity. This living thing that connected them to somewhere else, to someone else, kept alive through deliberate daily attention. The bread that came from a healthy sourdough starter was genuinely good. The slow fermentation developed flavor in a way that quick bread just doesn't have. After a week of hard biscuits and salt pork, a fresh loaf of sourdough bread was something people actually looked forward to. They earned that pleasure. Water. I keep coming back to water because the frontier kept coming back to water. Everything did. The American West was and is shaped by where the water is. Rivers determined where towns were built. Springs determined where homesteads went. Wells determined whether a farm survived. Digging a well was one of the first things a homesteader did. Hard, physical work digging by hand through rock and dirt, shoring up the sides to keep it from collapsing on you, going down 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet sometimes, not knowing if you'd find water at the bottom. When the bottom of a new well filled with clean, cold water, that was a moment. Cause for actual celebration. And then carrying it every day from the well to the house in buckets by hand. You got strong doing that. The settlers who farmed the frontier were physically strong in a way that's hard to even picture now. Not because they were extraordinary people, because the work built the body, because every single day required sustained physical effort. You carried water. You split wood. You dug and lifted and pushed and pulled, and your body adapted. And at the end of the day, you were genuinely tired, not just mentally done, the way we feel tired, but finished, pleasantly finished, in that deep in the bones way when you've worked hard and done something real. That kind of tired makes sleep easy. The management of food across seasons was one of the most important skills a frontier family had. You couldn't just go to the store when you ran out of something. The store might be 20 miles away. The supply wagon might not come for another month. So you planned. You stored. You rationed. Fall was the busiest time for food preservation. Root vegetables were dug and stored in the root cellar, a cool underground space that kept things from freezing in winter. Cabbage, turnips, potatoes, carrots. These kept for months in the right conditions. Meat was salted or smoked. Hog killing time in autumn was a significant event. Almost every part of the animal was used for something. Hams and shoulders were smoked. Bacon was cured. Lard was rendered from the fat. Nothing was wasted. Vegetables that couldn't be root cellared were pickled or dried. Green beans were dried on strings hung from the rafters. Corn was dried and ground into meal. All of this work happened in the fall on top of everything else. Harvest season and preservation season overlapped in a way that made autumn the hardest working time of year. But it was work with a clear purpose. Every jar sealed, every barrel filled, every smoked ham hanging in the smokehouse was a small victory. You were building the wall between your family and hunger. You could see the work accumulating in a way that felt satisfying in the most basic sense. You were keeping your people safe. Part 4. What home actually looked like come inside for a while. The homes of the frontier west were, I'll be straight with you, not impressive by modern standards. If you could step back in time and walk through the average frontier home, your first instinct might be to feel sorry for the people who live there, the smallness of it, the roughness of it, but something interesting tends to happen when you actually read the diaries of the people who lived in those small, rough homes. The pity shifts because those people didn't feel sorry for themselves. They were home, and they'd made it theirs with everything they had. Let's start with the sod house, because the sod house is so specific to this time and place that it deserves its own moment. It was the solution the Great Plains offered to the problem of having no trees. And it worked better than you'd think, and worse than the people inside it would have liked. You build a sod house by cutting the prairie itself into blocks. That dense, root-bound, centuries-old prairie grass. The roots of big bluestem can go 6 feet into the ground. 6 feet. The prairie is mostly underground. You cut through it with a special plow, and the root mat held the blocks together like natural brick, and you stack them up. Walls, too, sometimes 3 feet thick. Small windows. Glass was expensive in heat. Loss was real. A wooden door frame because wood was precious and you used it where it mattered. Most. The roof was sod too, laid over a wooden frame, and the roof leaked. They all leaked. Every sod house on the Great Plains leaked when it rained and kept dripping for days after the rain stopped as the water worked its way through the soil. One woman living in a sod house in Nebraska wrote about a rainstorm that lasted 3 days. The roof dripped the whole time. Everything inside got damp. She moved things from spot to spot, trying to find dry patches. She hung wet clothing over the furniture. She cooked with water dripping into the pot. She described all of this with the tone of someone reporting a mild inconvenience. Because it wasn't a catastrophe. It was Tuesday, but inside is where it gets interesting. You came through the door, and yes, the first things you noticed were the dimness, the smallness, the smell of damp earth. But then you noticed that someone had worked very hard to make this place comfortable. The walls were plastered on the inside. Frontier women figured out that a mixture of clay and water and lime, spread over the sod walls and dried, created a smooth surface that made the inside feel less like a burrow and more like a room. Some women painted this plaster. Some hung fabric. Against it, they were working with what they had to create something that felt like home. Because home matters. The human need for a place that feels like yours, that doesn't change based on what materials you have to work with. It just finds different expression. The furniture was often handmade. A frontier farmer with any woodworking skill would make furniture for his family. Not fine furniture, but solid furniture. A table with a good flat top. Chairs you could sit in comfortably for a while. Shelves that were level and sturdy. Some of this furniture showed real craft. Men who had the eye for it, who found satisfaction in making something well. Those men made things on the frontier that were genuinely lovely. Simple, functional, built to last. The center of everything was the fireplace or the iron stove. If you had a wood stove, and as the 1870s went on, they became more available, you were grateful. More efficient than an open fire. Less smoky. Better for cooking. A good iron stove was maintained carefully. Cleaned. Handed down. Cast iron lasts effectively forever if you care for it. The fire in the stove was the heart of the home. Literally, it was the warmth. And figuratively, in the way that fire has always been the gathering point. In the evenings, everyone moved toward it naturally. You sat near it to read, to sew, to talk. Light in the evening was precious. A kerosene lamp gave off a warm, slightly orange gold light. The circle of useful brightness extended maybe 4 or 5 feet from the lamp. Everything beyond that was shadow, which meant the evenings in a frontier home gathered people close. The family within the lamp's circle. Conversation low and easy. The children on the floor. The parents at the table. I think about what that was like. That intimacy enforced by the limits of light. You couldn't wander off to another room and disappear. You were together in the light by necessity, and that necessity had a gift in it: the beds, a wooden frame with rope, or leather straps strung across it to support the mattress. The mattress stuffed with straw or corn, husks, or if the family had sheep, wool. Straw rustled when you moved. What was quietest and warmest? Over the mattress, quilts. The quilts of the frontier are a subject entirely their own. Women made them constantly, not as a hobby, as a necessity, because bedding wore out and the cold was real, and they brought to quilt making a level of craft and artistry that is honestly remarkable. The patterns: double wedding ring, bear's paw, log cabin, flying geese. These patterns were passed down, traded between women, sometimes created new and shared through letters. The fabrics were scraps, pieces of dresses that had worn out, shirts past mending, children's outgrown clothes. Every piece had a history. Some quilts were literal records of a family's life. You could look at one and know that old blue was from my mother's Sunday dress. The red was from my oldest boy's baby blanket. The brown was from my husband's work shirt that finally gave out at the elbows. A quilt held memory. It held warmth. It held somebody's hours of careful work, hands that had already done so much that day and were still doing more by lamplight because the family needed it, and so the work got done. I find a quilt genuinely moving. Making a quilt was also a social activity. Quilting bees, where a group of women came together to work on a quilt collectively, were one of the few organized social events that frontier women had. You'd spread the layers out on a frame, and everyone would sit around it and stitch, and you'd talk while you worked. Hours of stitching and talking. News exchanged, problems discussed, advice given, laughter sometimes. The quilt that came out of a quilting bee wasn't just a blanket. It was a physical record of an afternoon spent together. Every woman who worked on it had left something of herself in the stitches. At night, with the lamp put out, the darkness was total. Not the darkness we're used to, where there's always some light coming in. On the frontier, away from towns, the only lights were the moon and the stars. Inside a closed cabin with no moon, truly dark. People weren't afraid of it, for the most part. They were used to it. It was just night, the ordinary absence of light that had been part of human experience. Forever, until very recently, you knew where the bed was, where the door was, where every piece of furniture sat. You moved through your own home in the dark by knowing it. The sounds of the night settled in. The wind. On the Great Plains, the wind at night had a low, present, continuous sound. Not threatening, just there. The voice of all that open land. The fire, burned down to coals, made small sounds. A tick, a settle. Outside, the crickets, so constant and pervasive you stopped hearing them the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. The breathing of the people near you, slow and deep. The breathing of people who had worked hard and were, for now, at rest. The smallness of a frontier home was also a kind of intimacy that's genuinely hard to come by in a modern world. In a one-room sod house, there was no hiding from each other. You knew how everyone slept, You knew who had bad dreams. You knew the sound your children made when they were sick versus when they were just restless. This closeness could be hard. Privacy was rare and often impossible, but it also meant that you knew your people deeply, not the surface version of them that you'd see at a distance, the real version, the unguarded version. And in a world where isolation was a real danger, psychological as much as physical, knowing that you were not alone, that the breathing you heard in the dark was the breathing of people who needed you and whom you needed. That was not nothing. That was everything. Part 5. How they laughed and played and passed the time. They're the moment I keep imagining. It's evening. The work is done, or as done as it ever gets on a frontier ranch, which means done for today and starting again tomorrow. The dishes are washed. The fire is lower. The children are starting to droop. And someone brings out a fiddle. Not an announcement, not a plan. Just someone lifts it out of its case, a battered, traveled instrument that had come from somewhere back east or maybe from somewhere in Europe before that. And they tune it by ear and then they play. Music was the most available form of entertainment on the frontier because it required nothing except a person and an instrument and the willingness to play. No electricity, no ticket to buy, no infrastructure of any kind. Just sound filling a room or a campfire circle or the open air. And the songs were old, older than the West. They'd come from Ireland and Scotland and England, carried in the memory of people who'd crossed an ocean and then kept going. They'd picked up American verses along the way. They'd changed and mixed. Cowboys sang to the cattle. This is true and not a myth. They sang to keep the herd calm at night. A herd of 1,000 cattle, spooked by a sudden noise in the dark, would stampede. And a stampede was one of the most dangerous things on a cattle drive. Animals and men could be killed. So the night riders circled the herd slowly in the dark, singing, not performing, just singing low and steady. The cattle heard the human voice and they were calmer. It meant things were okay. There's something about that image I can't shake. A man on a horse, circling a sleeping herd in the dark under those enormous stars, singing quietly to 10,000 pounds of cattle just to keep things peaceful. That's not dramatic. It's something else, something harder to name. The songs the cowboys sang to the cattle were mostly slow and low. Old hymns sometimes, simple folk melodies. The words mattered less than the sound. The human voice, consistent and present, moving around the perimeter of the herd in the dark. It said, "Someone is here. Everything is all right." The community dances were the biggest social events of the frontier calendar. When a dance was announced, a neighbor's barn, the hall above the general store, any cleared out space at all, people came from miles. 15 miles was not an unusual distance. You hitched up the wagon, bundled the family in, traveled through whatever the weather was doing, and you went. Because the next dance might not be until spring, and you needed this. The music was usually one fiddle player. No amplification. The fiddle carried the whole room, which meant the fiddler had to be good. And the good ones were never expected to pay for their own drinks. Everyone danced. Men who'd been alone on the range for months danced. Old women with bad knees danced. Children danced until they dropped and then slept in corners on piles of coats while the adults kept going. These dances weren't fancy. Square dancing, round dances, the caller calling the figures in a loud voice over the fiddle. Simple patterns, but in the patterns there was contact, a hand held, a moment of closeness. And on the frontier where human warmth was something you could go weeks without, that mattered. That was part of why people traveled 20 miles for it. The dances went late. People stayed because they'd traveled so far to get there and because the next one might be months away. Children fell asleep in the corners on piles of coats and were eventually carried to the wagon without waking. The ride home was quiet, the horse knowing the way, the adults sitting with the satisfaction of a night that had been genuinely good. Books were precious and read carefully. In a frontier household, a book wasn't something you flipped through casually. It was an event. A family might have only a handful. The Bible, almost certainly. Maybe an almanac, which was practical as well as readable. A novel or two if someone had been lucky or thrifty. These got read all the way through, and then again. Read aloud in the evenings. One person reading while the others listened and worked with their hands. Children who read well were encouraged. It was a genuinely useful skill. The dime novels deserve a mention here because they tell you something interesting about the frontier imagination. Cheap paperback books sold for a dime, full of adventure stories about cowboys and outlaws and gunfighters. And the people who actually lived in the real Wild West read them voraciously. Cowboys who spent their days doing the patient, quiet, unglamorous work of cattle ranching came back to the bunkhouse and read dime novels about cowboys doing heroic things. They knew the stories were exaggerated. They didn't care. It was escape into a more exciting version of their own world. There's something very human about that. Letter writing was another significant pastime and also a lifeline. Frontier settlers who had moved far from their families wrote letters constantly. Long letters, sometimes running to many pages, full of detail about daily life. What the weather had been, how the crops were looking, who had been born, who had married, who had died. These letters took weeks to arrive. The response took weeks more. A conversation conducted through letters moved in slow motion, but it moved. It kept people connected to the places and people they'd left behind. A letter from home was a significant event. You read it more than once. Checkers, cards, and dominoes appeared in homes and saloons alike. Not always for gambling, often just for something to do with your hands while you sat with other people. Games that required enough attention to keep you engaged, but not so much that you couldn't talk. While you played, children had their own world of play that required no equipment. The land itself was a playground, creek beds to explore, hay lofts to jump from, insects to catch and examine, animals to watch. The particular freedom of growing up with no fences on your imagination, just the wide open land going on as far as you could see. In the evenings after supper, when the weather was good enough to sit outside, people did exactly that. Sat on the porch or just outside the door, watching the light change. talking quietly, watching the stars come out one by one, listening to the night sounds beginning as the day sounds faded. This was entertainment too, sitting and watching the world, being present in it without needing anything to happen. The evenings were short, but they were good. The work was done, the food was eaten, and for a little while there was just life, music and conversation and stories and the warmth of people who knew each other. And then the lamp went out. Part 6. The night the sun sets. Out there in the west, a sunset is not a small thing. The sky is too big for it to be small. The colors spread from one edge of the world to the other. Orange and deep pink and a purple that deepens slowly into dark blue, and it takes a while. It's not quick. It's a long, gradual goodbye. People stopped for it, not dramatically, not formally. They just paused. You were carrying something and you set it down. You were walking somewhere and you stopped. You looked west, and then you went back to what you were doing. Inside, the lamp is lit. One lamp, maybe two. The light it gives is warm, not white like electric light. Gold, orange gold. It flickers very slightly, just enough to notice if you're watching it. The shadows are soft. Dinner is done. The dishes are washed. The evening is a few hours long at most. The evenings were quiet in a way that's hard to imagine today. No sound from outside, no traffic, no hum of neighbors' televisions, no background noise of civilization. When it was quiet, it was really quiet. The sounds you heard were close sounds, intimate sounds, the fire settling, someone's chair moving slightly, the soft sound of a page turning. Outside, the night sounds. Insects first, the crickets so constant and pervasive you stopped hearing them the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. An owl. Sometimes, far enough away to be mysterious. The children were put to bed. This was a small daily ceremony that was probably not always easy. Children have never wanted to go to sleep. That is a universal constant across all of human history. But eventually they went. They climbed to the sleeping loft or settled into their corner, and the room quieted. The parents stayed up a little longer, talked softly, did the small tasks of the evening, mending, accounts, plans for tomorrow. And then the fire was banked. Coals pushed together, covered to keep them going slow and low, so the house wouldn't go fully cold overnight. So there'd be something to start the morning fire from. The lamp went out, and the darkness was complete. That completeness, that full, real dark, we've almost forgotten it exists. We're surrounded by light now, light coming in from everywhere. And genuine darkness feels unusual when we encounter it. But for these, people was just night, the natural state of the world after the sun went down. They moved through their own homes in the dark by knowing them. Every step familiar, every piece of furniture in its place. You lay down, the mattress, the quilts, heavy, warm, with that slight smell of the fire. The weight of the covers settling over you. The breathing of the people near you. If you were on a cattle drive, the other men in their bedrolls around the fire. The low sound of the fire itself. The horses nearby, shifting, settling for the night. If you were in a farmhouse, the breathing of your family. Right there, slow and deep. The wind outside, On the Great Plains, the wind at night was a constant, low and present, not threatening, just there, the sound of all that open land breathing. The fire down a coals now, making small sounds. A tick, a settle, the iron cooling. The stars, if you could see them, were enormous. But your eyes were closing. The body knew what it needed. The body had worked all day, really worked with full physical engagement, and it was done now. The muscles that had carried you through were releasing. The weight of you was settling into the mattress, into the quilts. The thoughts quieted, not all at once. The mind did what minds do. It turned things over. What needed doing tomorrow? Hey, worry about the weather. Whether the west field looked dry. Whether the north fence needed checking. Small things, real things. But the body was already going, already sliding into the deep, uncomplicated rest of someone who has genuinely earned sleep. There's a quality to really earned rest that's different from ordinary sleep. Not just the unconsciousness of fatigue, but something more complete. A letting go that only happens when the body has genuinely spent itself in the physical world. When you've moved and lifted and ridden and worked, the sleep that follows is a specific kind of sleep. Deep and still and total. The cowboys and farmers and homesteaders and teachers and blacksmiths of the frontier west knew this sleep. They earned it every day, and they laid down into it without ceremony, without ritual. The mind quieted on its own because the body was finished. Outside, the stars turned slowly through the night. The moon, if there was a moon, moved across the sky in its slow arc. The wind moved through the grass in. Waves that you could hear as a soft, continuous rushing if you were awake to hear it. But mostly in the frontier homes and the bunkhouses and the bedrolls around the dying campfires, people were not awake to hear it. They were sleeping. The good, heavy, dreamless sleep of people who had done what needed doing. Tomorrow would come early. 4:30, maybe 4. The dark and the cold and the stars. The horses to feed. The fire to start. The coffee. Always the coffee. But that was tomorrow. Right now was the dark. The wind. The weight of the quilts. The breathing of people you loved, or the quiet of your own space, which is its own kind of peace. Right now was rest. The night sounds of the frontier were not alarming to the people who lived there. They were familiar. The coyotes calling in the distance, the horses shifting, the occasional sound of cattle moving in the dark. These sounds said, the world is as it should be. Nothing unusual is happening. The herd is calm. The horses are still. The fire is low and the night is. Passing in the way nights pass. And so you slept. And the hours went by in the dark. The stars wheeling slowly overhead. The wind moving across the grass. The small sounds of the night continuing around the sleeping settlement, the sleeping camp, the sleeping houses scattered across the enormous quiet land. Dawn was still hours away. Right now there was only the dark and the warmth and the sound of breathing. Rest. The quiet yin-y, that's it. That's the real Wild West. No gunfights. No dramatic showdowns, no outlaws and no heroes, and no one riding off into anything looking like they solved something. Just people. Ordinary, hardworking, tired, funny, struggling, enduring people. People who woke up before the sun and fed their animals before they fed themselves. People who rode for hours across open land and learned to love the quiet of it. People who built homes out of the ground itself and filled them with handmade quilts and kept their sourdough starter warm on cold nights like it was something precious. Because it was. People who traveled 20 miles in a wagon to dance in a barn. People who read dime novels about cowboys when they themselves were cowboys. Because sometimes the real thing isn't exciting enough and you need a story that is. People who sang to their cattle in the dark, circling slow just to keep things calm. People who looked at the sky, who stopped for the sunset, who stood outside in the pre-dawn dark for a moment before the day got a hold of them and looked up at the stars and thought something. Something Charlie Siringo kept trying to put into words and never quite could, but kept trying anyway. It was a hard life. Let's be honest about that. The winters could kill you. The droughts could ruin you. The loneliness was real and heavy. People died of things we treat in a day now, and they died young sometimes, and the people left behind grieved and then kept going because they had to. But there was something in it, something real and grounded and present. These people were not distracted. They were not pulled in 17 directions at once. They were exactly where they were, doing what was in front of them. And at the end of the day, they laid down and they slept. Nothing like the movies. Just people. Just days. Just rest. Your own day is done now. Whatever it held. Whatever was hard about it. Whatever was good. It's done. You carried it all the way through to the end, and here you are. Let it be done. The wind outside, whatever sound your own night makes. The weight of your own covers. Sleep well.